Co-Supervise PhDs, a podcast series by Tara Brabazon and Steve Redhead. Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon.
I'm Steve Redhead.
And welcome to podcast number 7 of How to Supervise PhDs. We're up to number 7, and this one is one where Steve and I are probably going to have a scrag fight in the car park because we actually disagree on this one, I think. So podcast listeners, let's find out. Podcast 7 is on co-supervision and co-supervisors. Now, first thing I would say is great supervisory teams are rare. Very, very, very rare. And as Steve's expressed as a sub-dean of graduate studies, part of his job is to put these teams together. And I think really for the first time, I've got a sense of the jigsaw puzzle that involves. But Steve, what do you think are the values of co-supervision?
Certainly the idea of a supervisor mentoring someone else is absolutely critical. I think I've said in these podcasts before that the Council for National Academic Awards, the CNA for short, in the UK, which I was on for a decade, actually did introduce that idea of supervision being at least 2 people. Could be more. Director of studies and a second supervisor. Second supervisor was normally someone who perhaps only had one supervision or perhaps none.
Yeah.
And the mentoring process within that supervisory team was seen to be crucial, and I actually like that system. I know a lot of people don't, but I do like that system, the idea of director of studies and supervisor. The trouble is that doesn't always work for all sorts of reasons which we may talk about, but yes, it doesn't always work. But in principle, I am actually in favour of having supervision which has at least 2 people, and partly for this mentoring reason.
Yeah. I, as most listeners know, have supervised probably 26 of my students on my own. Yeah. So I've had the sort of lone wolf supervisory model. Which
was always the model at one time.
Which has gone incredibly well. But again, you've got to be sort of a trustworthy, decent person prepared to sacrifice your life probably to do it. There are challenges with it, but can I say, I've co-supervised with you for the last little bit, which, we'd never done that before.
No.
We've only done it really since I was at Bolton, I think, with Lee, and I've found that great. The co-supervisors I've had before that have been deeply troubling, which we may get on to, and that's my second question, really. What happens if the supervisors don't get on?
And that is a regular problem.
Yeah.
That may be, in some ways, why the old Oxford system really started. That you had, one person and a student, partly because they probably wouldn't have got on with the other people who you could have put them with.
Yeah.
Supervisory teams are an incredibly important aspect of this, and I say they can be more than 2 people. I've supervised with 3 or 4 sometimes.
Wow.
Because you're getting expertise from all sorts of different areas, again, particularly with interdisciplinary stuff. And I think the richness for the experience of the PhD student is incalculable.
Yeah.
But supervisory teams do fall apart very often, or basically are skewed so that one person basically does all the work and the other person never gets involved. In principle it's a good idea, but often it doesn't work in practice. So I think that's back to candidature management and issues of sub-deans or deans of graduate studies. They've got to be really on top of that. And a lot of the time it's actually them doing research, or the different schools, as they do in the Faculty of Arts at CSU, look and have different systems for getting the supervisors in the first place and putting them on board and perhaps monitoring them and helping them. And then you've got an overarching role for the sub-dean to look at it when there are problems. But it's a really important thing, I think, to have supervisory teams which are good.
Yeah, so you've convinced me on that. There are 2 clear reasons for co-supervisors, and you have convinced me. One, and I've always believed this, content expertise, because no one unless the topic is very precise and it's right on your area.
Yeah,
and that does happen. It's happened me a few times. But when it's just sort of fitty, or it's on disciplinary boundaries, you do need another content expert.
Yeah,
So I think that's a crucial one. And also the mentoring, the training up of the junior colleagues, I think matters. Because even though you and I supervise together, both as professors, we've sort of only done that accidentally. It's not actually what I think is the best model at all, because I think we need to be helping our, more junior lecturer colleagues learn how to do this stuff. Because you and I, and a lot of people disagree with us, we see this as an apprenticeship mentoring model. We do see it as an older sort of medieval structure. A lot of people do disagree with us. Yeah. But I think that's actually how you learn. And so having the two of us supervise students is terrific for those students.
Yeah, and I think it was fair to say that Manchester Institute for Popular Culture, we had a lot of postgraduate students at Manchester Metropolitan University, which I think that was a great experience for me, because I was learning from my co-supervisor, Derek Wynne.
Bless you, Derek.
But he had a completely different attitude and sort of personality to me.
Involving bumming fags out the front of the building.
He would do that most of the time while I was talking to the students. Yeah.
But the students would then leave, go to the front of the building with him and talk with him in
absolutely,
a different way.
And he supervised in a completely different way to me, but we gelled for whatever reason. You can never really predict these things, but that was a great supervisory team, I think, looking back, for all sorts of reasons. But I learned a great deal. We were experienced academics together, but actually I learnt so much from his way of supervising, which I've adapted since. And also, you're just learning from that great experience that you were talking about before, the joyful experience, which was funny a lot of the time. It was great.
I mean, he was a funny guy, and so are you. What happens if the supervisory advice from the different supervisors is different? What does the student do?
I think the conflict thing is where that starts. And then the student, particularly early on in their PhD trajectory, starts to get worried and just doesn't know what the hell's happening. And then it unravels, because then they don't turn up to the meetings and the supervisors butt out, and you can see that sort of thing happening. And certainly as a subdean, I can see where that sort of thing starts, even if you've actually not had your finger on the pulse of it from the beginning. You can see how that unravels. Yeah. It's difficult because there's a hierarchy. We're talking about this idea of director of studies and second supervisor, and it's very difficult very often for the second supervisor to question the more senior person.
Yeah. Is part of it, Steve, what I always do, and this is again how you and I tend to supervise, because we agree a lot of the time, but we also radically disagree on things like, for example, agency. Don't get us started, ladies and gentlemen. But I think from the start of the supervisory meetings, particularly if they are held together, if conflict becomes the natural part of it, so you render sort of a robust intellectual discussion that this is about ideas, it's not about people, and the student's part of that. So in other words, there are multiple interpretations of this particular topic. Let's now rehearse them together as a family, shall we?
Yes, it can be positive, but a lot of the time it is just direct disagreement. Yeah. And the student is torn apart because one supervisor, maybe more than two, as I've said, one supervisor is saying one thing, another supervisor is saying another thing, and another supervisor is saying another thing, and they just get completely lost. And that often happens because academics in particular fields do disagree radically.
Yeah, so therefore, final question, how therefore can we manage those differences? How can they be managed from the student and the supervisory perspective to get a good outcome for the student?
In some ways, it's a matter of good progress reporting.
Yeah,
really. One of the things we've talked about before in this podcast series, if you have good progress reporting, where these sorts of things are real reflections on what's been happening in the last 6 months or last 12 months within the supervisory team, then I think that stops getting out of hand, because the student then does take control of the trajectory of the work, and it may be, using particular methodology or particular theorist or whatever it is. But if you don't get hold of it pretty quick, as I say, it can deteriorate and unravel very, very quickly, and then the whole thing just deteriorates.
Yeah. I also think too, changing the power differential a little bit as well, having a very powerful's the wrong word, but experienced and aware sub-dean or dean of graduate studies makes a real difference. I know at Murdoch, Frank Murray was my great mentors. He taught me just about everything I know about doctoral education. Respect you, Frank, mate. And he was great because he used to put all the pressure on the supervisors. And this is actually true at Murdoch. When the examination reports used to come back, and say an examiner found 5 typographical errors, he would bring the supervisor in and say, you stuffed up. There were 5 typographical errors. So he would, in some ways, invert or flip the power so that the supervisor had a level of responsibility. So the easy deflection of, the student didn't do this, the student didn't do that, started to shake up a little bit, started to agitate. So I think having that responsibility, the respectfulness in the supervisor has responsibilities to fulfill here, can, and therefore behave well, play well with others, team, because you're responsible for the outcomes and you'll be asked to come in and report on what's gone on here. That made a bit of a difference.
Yeah, I think that's a really good system.
Very naughty, but he did it very well. And again, my goodness me, it did put pressure on supervisors. Like, you prayed that people wouldn't find a typographical error so that Frank wouldn't say, in chapter 2, in footnote 104, you stuffed up. So that may be an option as well.
I think that's an excellent system.
Good one, Steve. Thank you for listening to this podcast titled How to Supervise PhDs. Please feel free to contact Steve or Tara at Charles Sturt University. We'd love to hear from you.